everyone, and thanks for joining us. We are live on Zoom and live streaming to YouTube. In just a minute, I'll introduce our guest, but before that, a reminder that if you're catching this event on YouTube, you can join us on Zoom for these events. To get the login info, go to our meetup group at meetup.com/CFL Freethought. Join us there and be sure to RSVP for upcoming online events and put them on your calendar. This event is part of our reoccurring educational events that we will continue to stream as YouTube events. You can find all of our past educational events and follow us on YouTube at youtube.com/CFL Freethought. As an update on our in-person events, we're not meeting indoors yet, but we have returned to our monthly park cleanups at Kewanee Park in Castleberry. So we hope that you can join us there next Sunday, March 14th. Pi Day, just to let you think about it that way. And for more information, you can find that on Meetup. Lastly, if you want to get a monthly email that will give you a list of all of the upcoming monthly events, you can just go online to tinyurl.com/CFFC newsletter. You're going to give us your email and any other contact information you like, and we're going to send you a monthly email. Of course, please follow us on Facebook. Find us there at CFL Freethought. If you're with us in Zoom meeting today, your microphone is going to be kept on mute so you don't actually or accidentally interrupt the presentation. If you keep your camera on, that's fine. Just do your best to avoid any huge distractions. You can find the chat option available at the bottom of your screen on your computer. Feel free to chat with anyone there. If you're on a mobile device, just kind of tap the screen and it should appear as an option. Chat is where we want you to ask questions today. So put those there and we'll get to as many of them as we can. We're also monitoring the live stream on YouTube, so you can comment there. Unless you are watching the late recording, then obviously your questions aren't going to be answered today. And with that, let's get started. Seráh Blain is a mom, an activist, and a humanist communications expert who happens to live also in Central Florida. With more than 20 years of political and nonprofit communication experience, Seráh has dedicated her career to advancing social justice through public policy and grassroots community organizing. She served on the board of directors for the Secular Coalition for Arizona, the Prescott Pride Center, and the Arizona Interfaith Movement. Seráh is currently partner and senior strategist at Spectrum Experience, working with humanist political candidates and nonprofits. And I just want to say that Spectrum Experience is pretty unique in that they're a full service humanist communications firm that works only with clients that are devoted to progressive humanist values and as well as political change. And they do all the things that a traditional communications firm does, but they're only working with exclusively humanist communications, clients, sorry. They help their clients create productive conversations about progressive values in public discourse. And beyond all of this, Seráh is the communications director for Foundation Beyond Belief. I'm sure all of you know this, but I'm going to share that Foundation Beyond Belief seeks to end poverty and hunger, promote good health and well-being, and foster employment opportunities and economic growth in ways that are going to exemplify humanist values. They provide grants, disaster recovery, a volunteer network, and they have Humanist Action, which is currently, I believe, overseas. Seráh was the recipient of the Foundation Beyond Belief's Humanist Innovator of the Year Award in 2014. Welcome, Seráh. And we cannot hear you.
I missed the unmute button. Can you hear me now?
I can. Welcome.
And is my screen shared?
It looks awesome. Yes. Can see
Excellent.
It very well.
Everything is going so well. Well, thank you so much for having me come speak. I've kind of been floating on the periphery of the Central Florida Freethought community since my co-parent, Rob, moved to Florida about 5 years ago from Arizona. And I've been slowly migrating to Florida full time. But when I kind of went all in and rented a house here, we got slammed with this pandemic thing. So I haven't had an opportunity to really meet everyone and get to know you. And I do look forward to more in-person time with everyone once the vaccines start to be more widely available. But until then, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to y'all about Foundation Beyond Belief, which I like to think of as the heart of the secular movement. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, Foundation Beyond Belief is an international humanist charity. As Jocelyn said, our mission is to end poverty and hunger, promote good health and well-being, and foster employment opportunities and economic growth in ways that exemplify humanist values. And yeah, as Jocelyn mentioned, I've done a lot of work in the humanist movement, doing communications work. I've had a lot of different roles in the non-theistic community. I've worked as a lobbyist. I've run campaigns for humanists. I've done communications for many secular organizations. But coming on board with Foundation Beyond Belief about 2 years ago has really been like a homecoming for me in many ways. Foundation Beyond Belief was born right at the same time that I was shifting away from my religious identity into my atheist and humanist identity. And that shift was accompanied by some sense of loss. In particular, I was losing my progressive faith community that I saw as an incredible force for encouraging people to live their values and for providing the structures of support and accountability that empower people to live compassionately and with generosity. And the lack of those structures was exactly what Dale McGowan, Foundation Beyond Belief's founder, was thinking about when he launched the organization in 2009 with the original mission to focus, encourage, and demonstrate humanist generosity. Now, I don't know if Dale saw this research prior to the founding of FBB, but 2009 was right around the time when sociologists David Campbell and Robert Putnam were kind of all over the air channels discussing their eye-opening research about how religiosity impacts behavior. You can read about it in their book they later published, American Grace, How Religion Divides and Unites Us. But what's especially relevant to us is that religious people donate and volunteer more than secular people, like a lot more. To begin with, religious giving dramatically outstrips any other kind of charitable giving. If we include religious hospitals, schools, and faith organizations, about 75% of all charitable donations in the United States are religious in nature. And even if we only include congregations and houses of worship, those organizations receive around $123 billion, which is more than double the next biggest charity category of education, which gets about $59 billion. Now, this is not an anti-religious talk, nor is Foundation Beyond Belief an anti-religious organization, but it is a humanist organization. And humanism is antithetical to in-group zealotry. And we can show that religious in-group zealotry in giving has some profoundly bad effects on people served by charities. It limits who can receive charity, the conditions under which they can receive it. It limits the moral imagination around what kind of giving is even needed, for whom, and why. So humanists should strive to counter these bad effects by working to shift the national character of philanthropy out of houses of worship and into the civic space. And that is cultural change work. So we need culture shifting institutions in order to do it. And here's another thing that's at least as important as the fact that religious organizations get more money. It's that religious people give more money, a lot more money. Religious Americans are actually 4 times more generous overall than their secular counterparts, even though religious people overall are slightly less affluent than secular people. And I know you're probably thinking, okay, well, religious people give more to religion, but secular people give more to non-religious organizations that actually help people. No, religious people do donate a lot to religion, but they also donate as much to secular charities as non-religious people do. And they volunteer way more, again, both to secular and religious causes. Among Americans who attend weekly services and pray daily, 45% have done volunteer work during the previous week, compared to about 27% of the rest of us. So what's going on here? Are religious people just better people? Is religious belief more effective than secular belief at inspiring moral behavior? No, it's not the belief. In fact, Putnam and Campbell found that belief has nothing to do with it, because people who have no religious faith or little religious faith still get these pro-social benefits if they attend church weekly, whether or not they buy into it. And people who have a strong faith but don't attend services are not more generous. They're not more communally involved or civically engaged than secular people. So there's something about communities structured around moral purpose that drives these pro-social behaviors. And the simple fact that people who participate in religious services are asked to give more, much more frequently than the rest of us. Congregations have built giving into the structure of the worship service and participation in religious life. So Dale and the founding board of Foundation Beyond Belief wanted to essentially create tithing structures that make it easy for humanists to give and to work to build generosity into humanist culture. So they put together a website that made it really simple to set up recurring donations that were then channeled into grants for non-religious organizations that work on causes like poverty, health, education, human rights, and the natural world. And hey, it's working. Since our founding in 2009, Foundation Beyond Belief has given more than $3.4 million in grants to charitable organizations. And our programs have grown. We now have partnerships with volunteer groups like this one. Y'all are part of our BBN team. We have volunteer groups all over the world that provide service in their communities. We provide logistical support and grants to our Beyond Belief network for them to do volunteer projects. And to date, our teams have logged more than 195,000 volunteer hours. We also have a disaster recovery program that has raised funds and deployed volunteers for recovery efforts all over the world. And our Humanist Action Ghana program fights poverty in Ghana. We've hired local talent there that are creating programs that empower women and build local expertise through vocational training. So humanists are starting to give more, and I think that's a trend that's going to continue. But now that we've begun to make headway in terms of getting humanists to give, our organization has begun to look even harder at what it means to give in a humanist way, to shift our focus from working to get humanists to be more generous to working to get charity to be more humanist, and perhaps ultimately work to abolish charity altogether, because a social model that requires marginalized communities to rely on the fickle generosity of people with wealth and power seems pretty anti-humanist to begin with. Okay, so what is the humanist way? Is there a uniquely humanist model of engaging in service and philanthropy? What would the core values of this humanist model look like? Well, I think we can start to narrow down some of these concepts with the example of last month's winter storm emergency that devastated Texas. So in mid-February, I became aware of the weather in Texas because our programs director, Wendy Weber, she's in East Texas, she messaged that she might not make it to the staff meeting because she was experiencing rolling blackouts. And then our Houston-based administrative manager, Leah, was without power and water. And then I learned that half our board in Dallas and Austin were also without water and power and heat. So usually when a natural disaster strikes, depending on the severity and if there's a gap in terms of what local government is able to provide and what the need is, FBB typically launches a fundraiser through our Humanist Disaster Recovery Program. We try to get money to people on the ground to help communities recover from disaster. And in this case, we were particularly worried about the homeless community. I don't know if you know this, but Houston right now is leading the country in evictions. And so the number of people experiencing homelessness in Texas has gotten really significant, and it's rising everywhere in the country. The predictions are that chronic homelessness in the United States is going to rise 49% over the next 2 years, related to the economic fallout from the pandemic. So shelters in Texas were filling up, and the temperatures were hitting life-threatening digits. I'm sure you heard on the news, people were even freezing to death in their homes. So this is a situation where we would launch a response. But the person who usually spearheads our response would be our programs director, who had no heat or power. And the organizations we wanted to raise funds for, our Beyond Belief Network teams on the ground who work with the homeless community in Texas's major cities, were themselves in a state of emergency. What's really incredible to me about this is that what happened is their own experience of hardship actually just triggered their empathy and motivated them to ethical action. Phil Session, who is on our board and also helps run Austin Atheists Helping the Homeless, has developed some really strong connections and relationships among people experiencing homelessness through the monthly giveaway programs that they run. And the people he'd been forming those relationships with were the people he was thinking about when he started getting cold. My boyfriend is installing a microwave right now. I don't know that he realizes I'm trying to give a talk. I apologize for the background noise. We all have our hardships. So another Austin Humanists Helping the Homeless volunteer, Lynn, talked about how she spent a whole day looking for firewood to warm up her house. And again, this made her think about how unsheltered people were surviving. Freethought Fellowship in Dallas also had members without heat and power. They had burst pipes, and their director, Zach Moore, told us, these were the times that reminded him of why their community exists to begin with. So, because we had boots on the ground that wanted to get to work, we did launch that fundraiser. And despite freezing temperatures and burst pipes and unreliable power, Wendy was able to work with our teams to coordinate and assess the needs of the most vulnerable people in their communities. Austin Humanists at Work immediately started putting people in hotel rooms before we even contacted them. That was their first instinct, get to work saving lives. All of these groups quickly discovered that unsheltered people had lost many of their belongings because of water damage, or they'd had to abandon them to seek shelter. So our teams bought up hundreds of sleeping bags and tents to replace those that had been lost, along with socks and thermals and food and other necessities. And it's actually no small task to find supplies like these in a state where the whole power grid is down and the distribution channels have just come to a standstill. This kind of work could not have been done from the outside. It required people present in the emergency who were already working in their communities. And humanism was at work in Texas. And I think that all of us in the humanist movement can be really proud of the work our colleagues have done in the face of such awful circumstances. Now, obviously, We would like the kind of humanist world where systems are in place to protect people from the horrors of what happened in Texas last month to begin with. But in terms of responding to a total societal failure, I think the core elements of a humanist model of generosity were really present. These are the same core elements that I think are critical to any humanist practice, and they are rare, relevant, applied, rational, and empathetic. Relevance is really built into the definition of humanism because the fundamental principle behind all varieties of humanism is that ethics are naturalistic and human-centered. Not that humans are the most important object of our moral concern necessarily, but that the need for ethics to begin with comes from the fact that we exist as humans with the wants, needs, and values associated with that. So if humanism is not concerned with the needs, wants, and values of the people in the current time and place, I mean, it just isn't humanism. And this seems sort of obvious, doesn't it? Humanist generosity should be directed toward what people actually need. But this is a challenge in philanthropy because donors and charity organizations have a tendency to come in from the outside and want to kind of save the day, imposing solutions on people for problems they don't actually have while ignoring the problems they do have. And there are actually psychological studies showing that the donor class, which is, middle and upper class people, we actually think we're more competent than lower class people. Privilege and wealth inflate our sense of our own abilities. Peter Buffett, one of Warren Buffett's 3 philanthropist children, famously calls this philanthropic colonialism, which begins with the lives and communities destroyed by the system that creates vast amounts of wealth for the very few, followed by philanthropists mistaking their wealth for expertise and paternalistically dictating to a community what they need, rather than listening and learning and supporting conditions for systemic change. In his 2013 op-ed on the charitable industrial complex, Buffett writes, "I'm not really calling for an end to capitalism, I'm calling for humanism." And humanism means valuing the dignity and autonomy of the people you intend to help. It means trusting people to be experts on their own experience and needs. It means acknowledging the limitations of our own knowledge of what others experience and need. It means being in relationship and being in community so that we can hear what is needed and we can respond appropriately. I think that probably proselytizing is one of the most obvious errors of relevance in charity, right? Where a religious group has decided that what people really need is the love of Christ, for example. And really, that's the last thing someone lacking basic necessities is looking for. For one thing, people already have all kinds of different belief systems and life stances that serve us very well for deriving comfort during difficulty and for making meaning in our lives. So supposing that people who are hungry or homeless are also suffering from some kind of spiritual deficit is both false and harmful, because what people need is access to food and shelter. This is one of the reasons that humanists moving into disaster work is so very important. It's a space that's currently heavily dominated by proselytizing religious groups. The Southern Baptist Disaster Relief Network is one of the largest in the world. They have something like 70,000 trained volunteers. And they openly state that this program is part of the Great Commission to make disciples for Christ. Bringing Christ to people who already have their own meaningful beliefs, but who just need shelter from freezing temperatures is peak philanthropic colonialism. The suffering of people in Texas during the storm was not a spiritual deficit. It was a systemic failure. And our task is to bring relevant solutions. And there are lots of more like benign examples of this too. I belong to a bunch of crochet groups on Facebook, and people are always wanting to make blankets for people who are homeless. And it just shows an utter lack of connection to the issues of homelessness to want to give someone a yarn blanket that will be impossible to keep clean, heavy if it gets wet, it's unlikely to stand up to the elements, it's not very warm, or if it is warm, it means you've got a ton of yarn in it and it's extremely heavy. But rather than contacting organizations to ask what kind of items might be needed that we should make, they've picked things they want to make to give to people who don't need them. And of course, our groups in Texas were actually connected to their communities and knew that what unsheltered people needed were sleeping bags, which are much more water resistant, lighter, warmer, etc. So humanist generosity is more effective both at alleviating suffering and at preserving human dignity when it works hard to be relevant in its application. And of course, the application part is really important too. Humanist generosity has to be active, engaged, and applied. We have to do the work of applying our values, because when we're the ones doing the work, we build the relationships to know where the needs are. Most humanists believe that this life is our only life. So we take seriously the value of life, and we take seriously our interdependence as a human and planetary community. Humanism is really defined by the action of taking responsibility for life. It is not just something that we think or believe, but it is what we do and how we engage with the world. It is how we actively cultivate caring relationships and erase arbitrary divisions between our human family. It's the application of humanizing practices that we bring into the world as we interact with it. Central to humanism is human responsibility and a belief that positive change requires human intervention. This is why our Beyond Belief Network teams matter so much to our evolving mission to laser focus on access to food, water, and basic necessities. We need to be present doing the work in local communities where we can listen, learn, rely on local expertise, and successfully apply our values. One of our teams in Arizona, the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix, has really impressed me with its evolution in this regard. HSGP is one of the few humanist communities in the country that owns their own building. They have a location in Mesa, Arizona. And the Greater Phoenix area has a really significant population of unsheltered people. And the shelters that are available have a lot of problems. People are frightened to use them. They aren't able to make the strict in and out cutoff times where they don't want to be separated from their partners, and most of the shelters are gender segregated. So you have a lot of people sleeping outside. And beginning a few years ago, people started to recognize that HSGP's patio and parking lot were kind of secluded from the street and seemed like a relatively safe place to sleep. Well, this brought a whole host of questions and concerns for HSGP. There were concerns about safety and liability, about several incidents of vandalism that occurred, some of them relatively serious, about trash being left everywhere. And those concerns initially framed the thinking around solutions. The policy was to get people removed from the space. They shut off power to the exterior of the building so that unsheltered people wouldn't use the outlets to charge their cell phones. And occasionally the police were called in. And all of these concerns were valid ones. We do need to be able to keep our own communities safe. But we also have a responsibility to be part of the solutions in our neighborhoods. And making homelessness someone else's problem, whether it's the police or the overburdened shelter system, that's just about as good as thoughts and prayers. You know, after some years of personally interacting with the people who used HSGP's patio for shelter, building relationships and hearing stories, the community started to learn a lot more about the problem and the needs. They were listening and learning and adjusting their response. They were engaging with people in a humanist way. They assessed their capacity. They looked for partnerships in the community. They took responsibility for positive change. And HSGP has recently launched an incredible program serving the homeless community. They have a relationship with a mobile shower service that sets up twice a month in their parking lot, along with groups that distribute food and other necessities. They've transformed what was a problem for their community into a service opportunity that benefits the whole community. HSGP doesn't have the capacity to be a homeless shelter. They can't do everything. But because they applied their humanism thoughtfully and humbly, they found a way to do something. And it was something very relevant, very rational, and very transformative. Rationality is a big, strong suit for the humanist movement. We appreciate the scientific method, and we understand how the process of hypothesizing, testing, measuring, going back to the drawing board, these are essential tools, not just for science, but for any kind of problem solving and for ethics. We can use reason to uncover and confront our biases, to bravely know the truth about our universe and make decisions based in reality as we uncover it. This allows us an opportunity to determine where our personal impressions are mistaken and to do better. Foundation Beyond Belief has used the principle of reason many times over the years to improve our programs. It's a key part of how our BBN teams have become a core way for us to demonstrate humanist generosity. As we looked at ways for our grants to be more efficient and impactful, to avoid redundancies and fill needs that aren't being met in local communities, we saw that direct service was often just so much more impactful than funneling money through third-party organizations, especially in disaster situations where those organizations are often coming in from the outside. During the Texas storm, it was actually difficult to find organizations to help because shelters were overburdened. There was really nothing they could do with additional funds. And outside groups really couldn't get in until after the weather lifted and roads were cleared and power restored and the crisis was ending. Having humanist boots on the ground was the most effective, the most impactful. And that's something we've learned and cultivated after years of disaster recovery work and measuring our impact. As a result of learning this, Foundation Beyond Belief is supercharging our BBN program in the coming year to more effectively address access to food, water, and basic necessities. We're going to be providing larger grants and monthly stipends for a pilot program of teams that have developed community-led, locally relevant food distribution programs. And we're creating targeted resources to help more teams start and run these programs. And our rational approach to humanist generosity is also improving our grant program. Since our inception, FBB has provided small grants to more than 100 organizations around the world, working on things like education and poverty alleviation and human rights. But through our relationships with these organizations, we started to see that we could really dramatically amplify our impact by focusing in on some key sustainable development goals and giving larger multi-year grants that could have a truly transformative effect for the charity receiving our grants. So we have just launched our new Compassionate Impact Grant Program, which provides a game-changing $150,000 grant over 3 years to organizations that serve and are led by members of the most vulnerable communities. And we'll actually be announcing our very first recipient of the new CIG grant next month, so stay tuned for that. And of course, as we go, we'll continue to think and learn and listen and measure and always improve. Empathy is one of the pieces we talked about at the beginning, where people like Phil and Lynn and Zach were triggered to action by this emotion built off of their experiences with people who are living without shelter. And it's one of the critical moral tools that Campbell and Putnam are talking about when they report on how participating in religious life develops pro-social behaviors. Empathy is a pro-social goldmine. It's linked to high levels of moral reasoning, social competence, volunteering, helping, sharing. I do think that humanists tend to be a little bit suspicious of empathy because it's a feeling and we want to be so rational, so scientific. We don't want to be led astray by feelings. But look, emotions can be cultivated responsibly, and science shows that empathy and compassion are critical to motivating moral behavior. And it's also true that empathy and compassion have cognitive content. Empathizing is the cognitive process of creatively reconstructing someone else's suffering. It is a way of providing context to rational facts that we might otherwise fail to understand fully, and the feelings that empathy and compassion evoke inspire us to act. Empathy focuses and energizes our willingness to do good. It stabilizes the ethical principles we develop through reason and experience. The problem of empathy is that it inspires us to help people who are the easiest to empathize with, and we're less likely to empathize with people we never interact with. We need to find creative ways in our humanist communities to address this empathy gap. But we do know that more interaction with more diverse people strengthens our ability to empathize with people unlike us, who we then discover aren't actually unlike us after all. So again, being in our communities, applying our values, hearing people's stories, building relationships makes us more empathetic and then more generous and more effective in our generosity. There is so much more I could talk about. When Jocelyn asked me to write a description for this talk before I'd written it, I had a whole list of big questions that are huge that I would love to go on and on about. Colonialism is this cultural mindset that's built into everything. And I don't know how we upend that. I wonder if our volunteer teams and our grants and our vocational training programs, are they enough? And of course they're not enough, but they're a lot. And every social movement has a beginning. The work that Foundation Beyond Belief is doing, along with some of the other national secular groups like American Atheists, which is really going deep into local advocacy, the work that we're doing to shore up our grassroots and be present at the margins of society gives us an improved understanding of who we are, how our society works and fails, and how to respond. What is required to undo the structures that create the need for charity to begin with, to invent structural humanism, to end poverty and hunger, to realize a humanist world. When we participate in this work together, we really are shifting the landscape of grassroots aid toward humanism. And if you're not already connected to Foundation Beyond Belief, I would love for you to sign up for our mailing list so you can get involved in our work. Right now, we're gearing up for the Secular Week of Action in May. So we'll be putting out a lot of resources, both for individuals and for groups to participate in a meaningful service-oriented alternative to the National Day of Prayer. So you can sign up for our emails on our website, foundationbeyondbelief.org, or you can just text FBB to 22828. And that's it. Thank you all so much for having me. Thank you for being a part of our Beyond Belief network and for all the volunteer work you do. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you so much. There is just so much that the Foundation Beyond Belief does. I remember actually hearing Dale McGowan speak back in, I think it was 2013. And it's just amazing what the organization has done. So it's been pretty, it's heartwarming for me as a member of the community to see the growth. And I really appreciate you being here. And I do have some questions. So let's go into those.
Let's do it.
So going back to the very beginning where you talked about volunteering at religious charities.
Yeah.
What about the fact that non-religious people are volunteering at religious charities and that our work there gets counted as part of their work in a sense? So isn't that?
It does. So it does and it doesn't. I mean, the Campbell-Putnam studies looked at the individual behavior of secular and religious people. So if you as a secular person were part of that survey and volunteered at a religious organization, it would have counted as a secular person doing volunteer work. So we do see that that secular people just don't volunteer as much. But you're right in terms of religious organizations are just larger and more established. They're older. They have, roots everywhere. And so it's going to take a lot of time. I mean, I'm sure you've seen all the studies that the nuns are growing, the religiously unaffiliated. There was an article in the Washington Post a few months ago about not only the decline in religiosity, but the decline in religious volunteerism and how that's going to impact religious organizations and who's going to take over this need if religious organizations starts to crumble. So it is really important that we build up more humanist structures and give people humanist opportunities for volunteering. And, a lot of the BBN teams that have really established programs have religious people come volunteer with them because they're looking for opportunities to volunteer. And I think so the same way that there's crossover where we'll volunteer with a religious organization, I think we'll find that religious people will be happy to do humanist volunteer work too, as long as we're, sharing values and get those structures in place and find ways to be effective.
And I assume those numbers that you were looking at also included secular charities, and they looked at like United Way. I mean, when we say that there's so much more on the religious side, that also is taking into consideration those groups, right? I mean,
yeah,
there's a fair number of them. Okay. Question that came up: how was Ghana chosen? Why did Foundation Beyond Belief choose to work in Ghana?
So the Pathfinder, the Humanist Action Ghana started as Pathfinder's project with Connor Robinson, and I'm pretty sure Wendy was part of the original Pathfinders program as well, where they wanted to create a humanist service program, and they actually traveled to many countries in the world and visited different programs. I think the Kasese School in Uganda that a lot of people are familiar with. I know I have mutual friends there with a lot of folks from this organization. Was one of the places they visited. So it was really like finding locations that already had local experts on the ground that we could work with. And Ghana just happened to have a really good program. At that time, it was the witch camps. They're camps where people, women in particular, are exiled when locals think that they're practicing witchcraft. And so there was a program there that was helping to get women reintegrated back into their communities to do education. And that was a really good fit for the humanist movement because we don't believe in witches.
No, we don't.
No, but it's really grown since then. We have a full-time staff there. We have a vocational training program. So again, just being connected with the local folks there doing the work, we're able to see what's needed and grow the program. So
that That makes sense. I mean, I assume a big search was done in a sense, but it just, all the things came together and Ghana was good.
Yeah.
Okay, so another question. Obviously, atheist humanist groups need to incorporate charity, you would say, into their regular events. How do they do that? If a group wasn't doing something already, how would you recommend that they get started doing that? And how do they identify what to do and to actually get started with that?
Yeah, well, so first I would say, each group is going to be so individual because it's going to depend on the capacity of your group and the needs in your own community. But I think that people know what's needed in their communities. I mean, the areas that have really high rates of homelessness, we need to address homelessness. When food insecurity is spiking, we need to address food insecurity. I think, the Oviedo area had some mutual aid groups cropping up when the pandemic struck, because the way that the suburbs are laid out, it makes it really difficult for people to get around. I mean, it's just people weren't able to access their school lunch drop-off locations when the schools shut down because everything is so sprawled. So having folks who can drive meals and things like that become more important in more sprawled areas. So I think really attentiveness to the needs of your community, and also feel free to get in touch with Foundation Beyond Belief, because that's Wendy's job. Like, she works with teams to help them set up programs in their communities. And we have tons of different guides on how to start if you want to do food distribution programs or giveaways to the homeless community. We've worked with tons and tons of different teams and can help make that happen in local communities. So yeah, paying attention to what's needed in your community, the capacity of your group, and talk to Wendy.
Okay, all right, that's good to know. And one of the things that you mentioned was that you guys you're encouraging us, local groups, to work with charities to encourage them to be more secular. How do we do that? How do we, maybe we go to an event and they typically pray, or they do something that may be off-putting to our members. What should we do to address this?
I mean, I think it starts with just being present and being honest about who you are. And a lot of times, some of that stuff is so unconscious, like people don't even think about how it would impact. I know when I volunteered for hospice many years ago, and there's just kind of this assumption that everybody wants to be connected to a spiritual higher power when they're dying, and that praying for somebody would always be comforting. And it just never even occurred to people that that might not be true. And so all I had to do was say that, and it was like, oh, so what do we do? So building those relationships, showing up, like if you're showing up regularly at a religious organization and doing the work, they're going to trust you and be willing to hear what you have to say, versus just sort of coming in from the outside and being like, hey, prayer is mean,
Don't do that.
Right. But I really don't think that people, because, a lot of the progressive religious organizations don't do really, like, they don't do proselytizing or prayer and stuff, but they'll have religious symbols or whatever. And they don't even think about how just having those symbols can feel sort of intimidating or divisive to people with either a minority faith belief or who are non-religious. And I feel like most liberal Protestants actually don't want to be hurting people with their religious symbols. It's never occurred to them that it would be hurtful. So just relationships and conversations.
Right, that makes sense. I know we try to do that, but I hope for anybody listening that they'll feel empowered to go and have these conversations if they're volunteering locally. A question that was posted was, humanists don't have a central place to gather every week or even a central location. So how can we rally together when we're so spread out? Plus, those religious organizations are doing the work, so they get the tithing and the donations to keep their churches going. It's not merely philanthropic. So this was kind of a two-part question, but.
Right. Well, I mean, we need those spaces. I 100% believe that we need to have our own buildings and community centers and gathering spaces, because those pro-social benefits that the Putnam-Campbell study I mean, there isn't a different way to get those. You're not going to get that volunteering at Planned Parenthood. You have to have a community that has a shared sense of moral purpose in order to get those benefits. And if we build those communities and invest in them, they are going to self-fund, because you want to give more when you're part. I mean, the pro-social benefit is we give more. We're gonna fund our communities. So I mean, it feels like a risk because it's expensive to buy buildings and you know, to invest, to get a mortgage, you know. But there are communities doing it all over the country, and they're able to do really incredible things once they get that space. So I really think that we need a humanist infrastructure. We do have to build those spaces.
It's interesting. I've actually spoken to clergy because we're a part of the Interfaith Council of Central Florida. And I've actually heard also, though, there's a lot of challenges with owning a building. Like suddenly you have all this additional expense and liability and insurance and all of these things that you could also take that same money. And I'm just playing a little bit of, I guess, devil's advocate here. You could also take that same money and pay for a manager, because we're all not, you know, we're all nonprofits and volunteers. But if you have money for a building, you might be able to actually, you know.
Well, right. I mean, I think there are lots of innovative ways of building that community. And I remember growing up, a lot of the churches that my mom took us to didn't have a physical space. They would meet in parks or, you know, like rent space in schools or whatever. So I don't think that it is necessarily owning the space that is the critical element of being in community, although there is a lot more, you know. I think it's something like 70% of all religious congregations run food pantries or something. I mean, it's a really high number. I'd have to look it up. And we can't do it. Like we don't have the places to do it. So there is something about the infrastructure. And I don't know that every single community needs to buy a building, but I do think that's something we should be looking at.
I agree. I mean, we've tried pre-COVID to have consistency with our meetings, to try to create that same feeling without actually owning the building, so that people knew, you know, this is where we were going to be on this day every month, and we could start to kind of foster that. It can be a challenge, though, to
It is, yeah.
Even think about a building, but it would be nice. How do local groups start a project that you would identify as being rare? Like, would you just say, have a conversation and make sure that you're meeting those guidelines, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty easy little acronym to remember. And I think that probably the relevance is the key piece, and the other parts of it serve relevance. You know, when you're empathetic and you're rational and you're actually doing the work, you're going to end up with a relevant program. So again, just really being out in your community. And I actually would say, you know, volunteer with other organizations first and see what they're doing, see what needs are being met, and what needs are missing. You'll learn a lot. And then you can come back together as a community and say, okay, here's what we've learned. Here's what we can see is missing. Here's what works and what doesn't. So I think connecting with other groups and having community partnerships is good. And, you know, even volunteering with other humanist communities that are sort of outside your area, show up at like a atheist community of Polk County Street Warriors event. It's a bit of a drive, but you'll learn about how they're doing outreach to the homeless community there. And that might be something that would be workable in this area. So connecting with other groups and other organizations and partnerships is a really good way to start. But yeah, that relevance piece is so, like, is this actually a problem that needs solving? What are the problems that need solving in our community?
Okay, that makes sense. There's a comment in the chat that says, I suspect many humanist volunteer with relief organizations but do not identify as humanist, and the organization gets credit as if all were religious when in fact many were not. Humanists lose a claim because so many prefer to stay in the closet. Why does it matter? Why, and I think we're kind of winding down here. Why does that really matter that we are volunteering and coming out as humanists and not just as we're here to help because there's a problem?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a couple of reasons. And one is, again, when the religious organizations are setting the structure of the volunteer work, the work isn't going to be humanist. They're going to come in with their power dynamics and their religious preconceptions about what's needed, versus if we as humanists have our own service organizations. And also, just more generally, it's a problem that conversations about national civic morality are always framed by religion. It is assumed that if you're a moral person, it is because you're religious, and you use the language of faith to explain morality. And that is very limiting in so many different ways. Again, it really limits the moral imagination about ethics and what is good for people. And by being honest about who we are, we can have much better quality conversations, both personally and at the national level, again, about what's good for people. We have to stop framing morality based on, 2,000-year-old books versus what we have discovered through science and cognitive science and sociology about what actually leads to a good life for people.
That's so true. And there is one more question. Amy posted, I volunteer for Feeding Tampa Bay. My Tampa Bay Coalition of Reason group is going to do a group volunteer. How do we publicize it? How do they get more people to actually come to the event? How do they get the word out over in Tampa? Is there a tool that you would recommend?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of different social media tools that you can use. You can do, I actually would recommend shooting me an email because I run a communications firm, and also Foundation Beyond Belief likes to help our groups and our volunteers, get more publicity. So I'm really happy to. I'm in Florida, so I can I can help with promotion.
And we will share your contact information here one more time.
Awesome.
I know that we as the CFFC definitely need to initiate more volunteer programs. I mean, we have a park, but we need more. And we have a lot of potential with so many people following us and supporting our work. And we need to recruit some champions for anyone listening who are willing to do work on these issues. And this is something that I think we should be looking forward to doing in the future. So
yeah, I agree. And I would love to get more involved too, as the pandemic lifts. And I know that sort of the loss of Be Orlando has left a bit of a hole in terms of volunteer opportunities for the humanist community. So I think we can work together to kind of fill that.
Yes, we will be a powerhouse here in Central Florida. It'll be awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'd like you to share any final contact information or email or anything else that you would like everyone to have so that they can find you.
Yeah, my email is just Seráh, SERAH, at foundationbeyondbelief.org. And again, if you want to sign up for the Foundation Beyond Belief email list, just text the letters FBB to 22828. And you can just go to the website to sign up too. It's just foundationbeyondbelief.org.
And I would add, for anyone who has a group and you may not be in our area and you're registering these things with Foundation Beyond Belief, it is super easy. The CFFC has been doing it for a while. You just go to their webpage and fill out some information, and you can share photos, and it's kind of fun and very easy to do. So I strongly encourage groups to definitely be a part of this, as well as individuals. All right, well, thank you so much. And I really think this is a very important topic, and I hope everyone will take it to heart. Thank you to all of your attendees who've joined us in Zoom or on YouTube. I we'll be announcing that our next event in 2 weeks will be a presentation by American Atheists. We have Allison Gill from the national organization and Devin Graham, who is the assistant state director. They're going to preview the current session of the Florida legislature, which just got underway last week. Allison's going to provide a brief overview on statewide laws and policies that affect religious equality and the separation of religion. Devin and Allison will then share details on specific upcoming bills, discuss how Florida's American Atheists plan to respond, as well as provide information on how we can help out. So we hope everybody can join us for that. Until then, we're still meeting on Zoom. We're going to continue our online social meetups, including Freethought cafes, secular women's events as Zoom meetings. You can join us from anywhere you have internet connection or mobile data. And if you need information on how to join us on Zoom, go to meetup.com/CFL Freethought. Also, I also want to throw out, we do have our monthly park cleanup in Castleberry next Sunday on Pi Day, the 14th at 9 a.m. You can find out information at meetup/CFL Freethought, more information on that. And we want people to be in touch. If you have questions, if you have anything you're wondering about, you can send us an email at info@cflfreethought.org. Again, if you want upcoming activity emails, sign up at tinyurl.com/CFFC newsletter. And with that, we're going to bid everyone farewell. And until we can see you again, stay safe, keep looking out for one another. And thank you for coming today.